This video is brought to you by pinesandmaples.ca, where you can find all kinds of great Canadian products made by Canadian creators. Enjoy!
After speaking with the French fur traders, Henry decided that it would be in his best interest to bring his trade goods to the Nadawizis, or the Dakota Sioux of Lake Michigan, and the Chippewa, or Ojibwa, of Lake Superior. On the day of his departure, however, Fort Michilimackinac was visited by about 200 Ottawa warriors from a southwesternly village called La Croche, or Crooked Tree, which revolved around a Jesuit mission. Henry described these Ottawa as being, quote, much advanced in civilization, unquote, compared to the Ojibwa of Mackinac on account of their proficiency in the art of growing maize or Indian corn. The Ottawa chiefs ordered Henry and his men to meet with them in the fort's governor's house. There, one of the Ottawa leaders addressed the traders, telling them that he and his people had been glad when they heard the news that English traders had arrived in the country, as they were in desperate need of supplies. They became dismayed, however, when they learned that these goods would instead be transported away and sold to other nations, some of whom were their enemies. The chief then implored the Englishmen to give every Ottawa man 50 beaver pelts worth of goods and ammunition on credit, assuring them that his people would pay their debts in the summer. Henry and his men learned, presumably from the French traders at Mackinac, that the Ottawa were notorious for failing to repay their creditors. When the Englishman and his voyagers attempted to negotiate better terms, Ottawa informed them that they would give them 1 day to consider their initial offer. If they refused it, the Ottawa would take the traders' goods by force. That night, as the traders pondered their situation, Henry and his men were visited by Farley, their French interpreter. Farley informed them that the Ottawa intended to murder them that night and urged them to accept the proposal before they launched their attack. Henry, however, distrusting the Frenchmen, suspected that the disturbing report was nothing more than an attempt to induce him and his men to abandon their enterprise. Instead of taking Farley's advice, Henry armed his men with muskets and stationed guards around his house. Fortunately, the night passed quietly. The next morning, the Ottawa asked Henry and his men to attend a second council with them. The Englishman and his voyagers simply refused the offer, opting instead to remain in Henry's cabin. That night, they received the comforting and unexpected news that a detachment of British soldiers had been tasked with garrisoning Mackinac and were expected to arrive early the following morning. Henry and his traders spent an anxious night in the house, having received word around midnight that the Ottawa were holding a war council. To their surprise and relief, however, the Ottawa broke camp and departed without a fight just before sunrise. Later that morning, the fort's French traders met with the adventurers and congratulated them on their good fortune. The Frenchmen told Henry and his men that the Ottawa had proposed that they join them in a surprise attack on the incoming English soldiers. The refusal to participate in the ambush disheartened the Ottawa and was the reason for their departure. That day, at noon, 300 infantrymen of the British Army's 60th Regiment of Foot marched into Fort Michilimackinac, relieving Henry and his men of all their anxieties regarding the Ottawa and other hostile Indians native to the area. While natives from all around flocked to the fort to pay their respects to its new British commander, a number of Henry's voyagers set out on their planned journeys to Lake Michigan and Superior. Before chronicling his winter at Mackinac, Alexander Henry described the provisions on which the French-Canadian voyagers subsisted during their long voyages into the heart of Indian country. Specifically, the voyagers from Mackinac were supplied with maize, or Indian corn, grown in southwesternly village of La Croche, home of the Ottawa natives with whom Henry and his men had just had their uncomfortable brush. This species of grain, Henry wrote, is prepared for use by boiling it in strong lye, after which the husk may be easily removed, and it is next mashed and dried. In this state it is soft and friable like rice, unquote. This process, known today as nixtamalization, not only makes the corn more nutritious and palatable, but also destroys potentially dangerous toxins which sometimes contaminate untreated maize. Henry wrote that the French-Canadian voyagers subsisted almost entirely on this substance, along with pure rendered fat, during their 14-month-long journeys into the Canadian wilderness, each man being allotted 30 quarts of nixtamalized corn and 2 pounds of fat per month. Henry speculated that the unique ability of French-Canadian voyagers to stomach and survive indefinitely upon this bland fare was a major factor behind the French's hitherto monopoly of the fur trade in the region. Fort Mackinac's new British commander allowed Alexander Henry and the men who remained with him to spend that winter at the fort. The adventurers combated the winter's monotony with hunting partridges and hares, and ice fishing for lake trout, whitefish, and sturgeon. Henry wrote that his men and the fort's occupants dined chiefly on trout. Although few natives visited the fort that winter, a certain Ottawa chief and his family came to often sell beaver meat. This chief, Henry wrote, had been taken prisoner by Sir William Johnson, a celebrated chief commander, during the recent battle of Fort Niagara. Johnson had granted the chief his freedom and given him a silver medal and a British flag. Very pleased with these unexpected gifts, the chief became sympathetic to the British cause and began displaying the Union Jack atop his wigwam. This act angered many of his compatriots who remained loyal to the French, some of whom destroyed his home and tore his flag to pieces. Thereafter, the chief often came to the fort and showed him the tattered remains of his British flag to the soldiers, who would then supply him with, quote, as much liquor as he said was necessary to make him cry over the misfortune of losing his flag, unquote. On May 15, 1762, about a month and a half after the ice broke upon Lake Huron, Alexander Henry sat out in one of his canoes for the northernly village of Sault Ste. Marie, the site of a Jesuit mission and one of the oldest French fur trading forts in North America, nestled in the strait which separates Lake Huron from Lake Superior. Henry reached Sault Ste. Marie on May 19th. After a 4-day journey and a paid visit to the fort, he described the complex as consisting of 4 houses enclosed within a square of wooden palisades. Encamped nearby were bands of both Ojibwa Indians and members of a peaceful nomadic tribe which Henry called Men of the Woods, and gens de terre, or Earthmen, probably the Mississauga Indians. Hoping to become fluent in the Ojibwa language, Henry spent more than half a year at Sault Ste. Marie, spending his time fishing, smoking his catch in the Indian fashion, conversing with the fort's interpreter, a Métis named Jean-Baptiste Gadot, whose family spoke only Ojibwa under their roof. During his stay, a troop of British soldiers arrived at the fort and garrisoned themselves within it. On December 22nd, a fire broke out in the fort, consuming the commander's residence and destroying much of the soldiers' supplies and provisions. The soldiers managed to sustain themselves for some time by snaring hares, hunting partridges, and spearfishing via holes cut through the ice. In February, Henry, the garrison's commander, and a handful of Ojibwa hunters and French-Canadian voyagers made the journey to Michilimackinac, where they purchased provisions for the soldiers at Sault Ste. Marie. During his stay in Michilimackinac, Henry befriended an Ojibwa chief named Wawatam, who often came to the fort to visit him. During one of his calls, he brought his entire family with him, along with a gift of skins, maple syrup, and dried meat, which he presented to Henry. The native then informed the Englishman that, years prior, he had spent several days fasting alone in the wilderness in the hope of receiving a vision from the Great Spirit. During this spiritual retreat, he had a dream in which he adopted an Englishman as his brother. Wawatam believed that Henry must be the Englishman he saw in his dream and proposed that they become blood brothers. Henry accepted Wawatam's proposal and gave the Ojibwa a present of his own, much to the chief's pleasure. Henry stayed on the island until March 10th, whereupon he snowshoed back to Sault Ste. Marie via St. Martin Bay. During this trek, Henry suffered from what he called snowshoe evil, an inflammation of the tendons on the lower leg which locals cured by pressing burning torchwood to the affected site and burning the flesh to the nerve. This experiment, wrote Henry, though I had frequently seen it attended with success in others, I did not think proper to make upon myself. Alexander Henry spent the spring of 1763 at Sault Ste. Marie, during which time he assisted the resident soldiers in producing maple syrup. He returned to Michilimackinac on May 20th, accompanied by a traveling English gentleman named Sir Robert Dovers. In addition to the British soldiers who had taken up residence there 2 years prior, he found the fort occupied by a number of French fur traders who had traveled there from different parts of the Great Lakes. At that time, there was a rumor floating around the fort that the local Ojibwa Indians planned to launch an attack on the garrison and kill all the Englishmen therein. About 400 of these natives were camped around the fort, and although they appeared perfectly friendly when they brought in their furs to trade, Henry warned the fort's commander not to trust them. On June 3rd, Henry was visited by his Ojibwa blood brother, Wawatam, who seemed uncharacteristically depressed. The chief told Henry that he was sorry to see him at Michilimackinac and expressed his hope that his adopted brother would accompany him to Sault Ste. Marie. Although he never explicitly said as much, the chief implied that something evil was about to befall the fort and hinted that the Ojibwa camped nearby would have a hand in it. Henry thanked his adopted brother for the information, but informed him that he would not leave the fort until he had concluded some unfinished business. "I had made," wrote Henry, "so much progress in the language in which Wawatam addressed me as to be able to hold an ordinary conversation in it, but the Indian manner of speech is so extravagantly figurative that it is only for a very perfect master to follow and comprehend it entirely." Unfortunately, Henry had not sufficiently mastered the language at the time, and failed to interpret Wawatam's message as a dire warning to leave at the earliest opportunity. When the chief realized that he would not persuade Henry to leave the fort, he departed in visibly low spirits. Ominously, Henry spent the rest of the day selling tomahawks to the Ojibwa warriors and, at their request, showing the braves an inventory of items he had for sale. The following day was June 4th, the birthday of King George III. In honor of the great English chief, the local Ojibwa warriors decided to play a game of lacrosse against a neighboring band of the Sauk Nation. The Ojibwa declared that the game would be played outside the fort's walls, and invited the resident Englishmen to watch it. Many of the English soldiers, including Major George Etherington, who commanded the garrison, accepted the Ojibwa's offer, and filed out of the fort to watch the game, leaving their weapons inside. Alexander Henry, on the other hand, used the opportunity to write letters to distant friends. Unbeknownst to the hapless English soldiers who were lounged in the field outside the fort as the game commenced, the Ojibwa had concocted a brilliant plan to capture the fort by surprise. While the soldiers were distracted by the Indians' athletics, a handful of Ojibwa women inconspicuously made their way towards the fort's open gates, concealing bundles of tomahawks and scalping knives beneath the blankets they wore around their shoulders. When the women were in place, one of the native athletes lobbed the lacrosse ball over the fort's walls, ostensibly in an effort to keep it from falling into the hands of his Sauk opponents. The Ojibwa athletes subsequently raced into the fort, where they seized the weapons that the women had smuggled inside. While he sat composing in his cabin, Henry heard a cacophony of Indian war cries erupt outside. "Going instantly to my window," he wrote, "I saw a crowd of Indians within the fort furiously cutting down and scalping every Englishman they found. Henry seized a flintlock shotgun and contemplated stepping outside to help his fellow countrymen, some of whom were being scalped alive before his eyes. To do so, he quickly realized, would be suicidal. With little thought now but to hide and wait out the storm, Henry frantically scanned the surrounding courtyard for refuge. His eyes fell on a handful of French-Canadian fur traders who calmly watched the slaughter unfold from the safety of their cabins, apparently secure in the knowledge that the Indians would not harm them. Henry snuck out the back door of his cabin and jumped the fence that separated his residence from that of his neighbor, a French-Canadian trader named Langlade. He peered through Langlade's back door and saw that the trader's whole family had gathered by the window to watch the massacre unfold. He called out to the Frenchman and asked if he could hide in his home. Langlade shrugged his shoulders, indicating that he was powerless to help the Englishman, before turning back to the window. Fortunately, Henry's entreaty attracted the attention of a Pawnee Indian slave woman who served in the Langlade household. Without her master's knowledge, the servant beckoned for Henry to follow her and guide him to a tiny attic in the Langlade cabin. Once the Englishman was safely inside, the Pawnee locked the door behind him and took away the key. Through a crack in the wall, Henry watched the Ojibwa warriors go about their grisly work. The dead were scalped and mangled, he wrote. The dying were writhing and shrieking under the unsatiated knife and tomahawk, and from the bodies of some, ripped open, Their butchers were drinking the blood, scooped up in the hollow of jointed hands and quaffed amid shouts of rage and victory. When the slaughter was complete, a number of blood-stained Ojibwa braves entered the Langlade home. The warriors asked the fur trader whether any Englishmen were hiding in his house, to which Langlade replied that they were welcome to search the place to their satisfaction. The warriors immediately pulled on the door to the attic and found it locked. His heart hammering in his chest, Henry crawled to the corner of the room and covered himself with birch bark baskets, sticky with maple syrup. No sooner had the Englishman concealed himself than the attic door was unlocked. An instant after, wrote Henry, 4 Indians entered the room, all armed with tomahawks, and all besmeared with blood upon every part of their bodies. The die appeared to be cast. I could scarcely breathe, but I thought that the throbbing of my heart occasioned a noise loud enough to betray me. The Indians walked in every direction about the garret, and one of them approached me so closely that at a particular moment he had put forth his hand. He must have touched me. Somehow the Indians failed to find the Englishman, shrouded as he was by the darkness, and eventually left the attic, leaving Henry, quote, with sensations not to be expressed, unquote. Exhausted from fear, Henry crawled over to a feather bed nearby and collapsed into a deep sleep. He was discovered the following day by Langlade's wife, who agreed to keep his presence a secret. The next day, a party of Ojibwa warriors, all of them roaring drunk, stormed into the Langlade home and informed the fur trader that Henry's body had not been accounted for, and that they suspected that either Langlade or another French-Canadian fur trader was hiding him. His wife, speaking in French, which the Indians did not understand, implored her husband to give up Henry, of whose presence she had previously informed him despite her promise to the Englishman, so that their children would not suffer retribution in the event that the Indians discovered him themselves. Langlade acquiesced and led the Indians to the attic, delivering Henry into their hands. Henry was captured by a warrior named Weniwe, who after some contemplation decided to adopt him as his brother rather than kill him on the spot. After surviving a murder attempt by an Indian who owed him a trading debt, Henry was brought to a cabin in which Ojibwa chiefs had lodged Major General Etherington and 2 other high-ranking officers. These prisoners had been spared the slaughter in the hope that they could be ransomed. There, Henry learned that the Ojibwa had killed 70 Englishmen and imprisoned about 20.